When a locked office door and a string of bridge and fee transfers surface on their shared accounts, a spreadsheet-loving husband starts digging. What begins as a domestic oddity becomes a hunt through crypto dashboards, aliases, and threats, until the truth tests his marriage and his nerve. I always thought marriage was mostly errands that never end and inside jokes that never die, and I was happy with that because the quiet, repeatable parts of life suited me, and my wife Mira seemed to like them too, as we built a rhythm around grocery lists and weekend hikes and a shared spreadsheet that tracked boring things like mortgage principal and retirement targets, and which of us had paid for the last oil change. So when I say I never saw it coming, I am not dodging blame, I am admitting that I confused routine with certainty and left the gates of our life wide open. The story really begins on an ordinary Monday that carried the scent of dishwasher soap and wet dog because our neighbor asked us to watch her retriever, and the dog knocked over a plant, and I spent the evening vacuuming potting soil while Mira worked late in her office with the door mostly closed, which was not unusual since she consulted for small companies and often had client calls across time zones, and I only noticed anything different because the door was actually locked and we did not lock doors in our own house. I told myself there had to be a normal reason, and I kept vacuuming, and after a while she came out with that dazed, productive look people get after long video calls, and she said she needed to get fresh air and took the dog for a walk, and I sat down to reconcile the shared spreadsheet because that is my kind of fun, and that is when a small weirdness nudged me since the account we called Nest Egg showed a transfer that I did not recognize in the memo. Simply said bridge, and I figured it was some clumsy bank label and clicked through and saw another transfer from the same day labeled bridge again, and another from the week before labeled fee, and suddenly the vacuum lines in the carpet looked like crop circles left by a very patient alien. We were not rich by any stretch of imagination, yet we had saved with the discipline of two people raised in households where coupons were organized by category, so the numbers hit like cold water since these were not the silly $5 kind of errors, and they were not autopay bills either, and after a few minutes of staring I reminded myself that mistakes happen and banks fix them, and I drafted a calm message to customer service, and then I hesitated because the pattern stretched back months. And every entry used the same two words repeated in varying order, as if a magician had named both of his hands fee and bridge. That night I did not ask Mira anything because it felt easier to sleep near a question than to wake it up, and I convinced myself that she would bring it up once she noticed my message to the bank the next morning, and the next morning arrived with the gray light of early spring and a message from the bank that made my throat go dry since the transfers were authorized through our joint credentials and occurred from our home network and included 2-wire instructions that I definitely did not set up, so I stared at the screen while the dog stared at me as if waiting for me to throw something worth chasing, and the only thing I could think to throw was my sense of calm. I took a day off work by telling my boss that a house issue had popped up, and this was not entirely untrue because a house is not just bricks and wood, it is a ledger of trust, and mine had a red line that would not stop expanding, so I made coffee and opened the folder where we kept tax records and found nothing useful. And then I opened the small fire safe we used for passports and found a plastic card I had never seen with the word Kraken on it, which sounded like a roller coaster or a craft beer. And because I am the sort of person who reads everything, I flipped the card over and saw a note in Mira's handwriting that said 2-factor key, and I did not know what that meant, but I knew it meant something. I am not the type to snoop, yet there is a difference between curiosity and triage, so I sat at her desk and gently woke her laptop and expected a password screen, but the lid had not fully closed and the machine blinked alive into a dashboard filled with graphs made of neon colors that moved like EKG lines, and the word spot wallet and staking and withdrawal queue sat next to numbers that made my pulse jump because they were not pretend numbers, and the total balance said 0 while a column of past activity showed amounts that looked like the down payment for 3 houses in the town where we grew up. I leaned back and listened to the refrigerator hum and the dog snore and my own breathing pick up speed, and I tried to assemble a story that would make sense of this because a good marriage thrives on generous interpretations, and I wanted to give her that, yet the arithmetic refused to play along, and then a message in the corner of the screen popped up with a tiny avatar of a person wearing sunglasses and a caption that said broker online now, and another line that said withdrawal enabled after settlement, and it felt like standing in a foreign airport where every sign looks friendly until you realize none of them lead to your gate. I closed the laptop and paced the hallway and decided to ask her directly when she returned from a mid-morning errand, since she said she needed more printer paper, and when she came back I tried to create a gentle opening about budgets and upcoming bills, and I watched her face do a small twitch that I had never seen before, and she gave me a breezy answer about handling a client retainer, and I wanted to believe it, yet the room felt tilted, and when she went to shower I opened the laundry hamper to toss in a towel and found a crumpled envelope from an overnight courier that held a cashier check receipt made out to her name for an amount that matched one of the transfers, and the memo said withdrawal fee. I stood there with the envelope in my hand and a dog at my feet and the shower running and every ordinary sound of home mixing into something that no longer felt ordinary, and I realized that whatever story I had built about our life had sprouted a secret wing, and that wing had flown far from the nest, and the only question left was how far, because the numbers hinted at a distance measured not in miles but in years of work, and I felt a strange calm settle over me, as if my body knew that panic would be expensive and clarity might be free. The shower stopped and I slid the envelope back under the shirt where I had found it, and I told myself that tonight I would ask for the full map because I needed to know what bridge and fee really meant and whether the person with sunglasses on the screen was a broker or a mirage. And as I poured kibble into the bowl, I heard her phone ping with a new message that lit the screen with a name I did not recognize and 3 words that did not help at all since they said funds in escrow, which sounded like safety and smelled like smoke, and I knew the next step would set the tone for everything that followed, so I took a picture of the message and waited for the dog to finish eating while I tried to decide whether to wait for night or ask right now, and that is where the day left me poised between patience and a cliff edge, wondering which one would hold. I did not sleep much that night, though I kept my eyes closed out of habit and counted the slow rhythm of Mira's breathing beside me as though it might carry me somewhere safe, but every time the sound deepened I found myself staring at the ceiling, tracing the faint glow of the smoke detector, and thinking about those words funds in escrow, which rolled through my mind like a marble in a glass bowl because they sounded both official and evasive at the same time, and I kept asking myself who would send them and why would they reach her phone at 11 at night when most people are watching some show to fall asleep. By morning I had decided that waiting was no longer helping and that knowledge, even painful knowledge, would be cheaper than speculation, so while she made her coffee I leaned against the kitchen counter and told her that I had seen the transfers in our account and asked what bridge and fee meant, and for a moment she simply blinked as though the words were in a language she used to know but had forgotten, and then she smiled, the kind of smile that people practice when they think they are acting natural, and she said that bridge was a nickname for a project she was managing for a client, and that fee was the associated retainer structure, which sounded very businesslike but also rehearsed, and the dog sitting by her leg tilted its head as if it too sensed the performance. I wanted to believe her, I really did, because our marriage had always been built on the assumption that belief came first and evidence came later, but something in her tone was thinner than usual, and when she left for her co-working space I noticed that she had left her travel mug half full on the counter, which she never did, and it hit me that people start leaving small pieces of themselves behind when they are already halfway out of something bigger, and I stood there staring at the mug until the coffee cooled and the house filled with the smell of whatever line separates ordinary worry from suspicion. Work was impossible that day. My mind kept looping through every little detail that had once seemed random: the late nights, the secretive laptop, the sudden fascination with cryptocurrency podcasts that she said were just background noise while she cooked, and I realized how long I had been accepting surface answers because they were comfortable, and how little I actually knew about her world beyond the edges of our shared habits, so I decided to get uncomfortable. I drove to the bank during lunch and asked for a detailed printout of the recent transfers, and the teller handed me a stack of paper that felt heavier than its weight suggested, and there they were, the repeating entries under her name, all marked as outgoing wire transfers to an account belonging to a company called Ellion Strategies Limited, a name that meant nothing to me but sounded intentionally vague, like a firm that specialized in existing only on paper. I thanked the teller and drove to a park where I could sit without being recognized and stared at the papers, trying to imagine how to confront someone you love without turning into an interrogator. That evening she returned later than usual, her hair damp from rain and her mood brisk, as if she had already prepared for a conversation she didn't want to have, so I started gently mentioning that the bank had called to confirm some activity, and I wanted to make sure it wasn't fraud, and she laughed, though it came out brittle, and said, "Oh, that old thing, I already told you, it's client money moving through a managed account," and I asked if she could show me, just for my peace of mind, since the bank had flagged it, and that is when her face changed, not with guilt exactly but with something closer to alarm, as though I had accidentally stepped on the loose floorboard under which the truth was hidden. She said the laptop was at her office and that she couldn't access the client dashboard from home due to security protocols, and while that might have sounded convincing to anyone else, I could feel the hollowness in the explanation because I had seen that very dashboard glowing on our dining table 2 days ago, so I nodded slowly and said, "All right, that makes sense," and watched the tension in her shoulders relax just enough for me to confirm what I already knew, that she was managing something far more personal than client assets. After dinner she went to bed early, claiming a headache, and I stayed up cleaning the kitchen longer than necessary until I could hear her breathing shift into the rhythm of sleep. Then I walked quietly to her office, the one she kept locked, and tried the handle and found it open, maybe by accident or maybe because she thought I wouldn't check twice. The room smelled faintly of lavender and printer toner, and the monitor still showed faint ghost lines from the same dashboard I had seen before, only now There was a small sticky note on the edge of the screen that said withdrawal release pending approval Tuesday, and I had no idea which Tuesday that meant, but it was close enough to today to make me nervous. I sat down and stared at the numbers again, not out of greed or jealousy, but because they represented years of shared work, and I couldn't tell if they had vanished into some speculative investment or been siphoned into someone else's account entirely. The cursor blinked like a pulse waiting for my next move, and I decided to check the browser history since that required no passwords, and there it was, a trail of visits to a messaging platform I had never heard of before called Glassline, which described itself as secure communication for private finance professionals, and something about the word private echoed in my chest like a warning. The next morning I tried to act normal and asked if she wanted to meet for lunch near her office, something we rarely did because of our schedules, and she hesitated too long before agreeing, which told me enough when she texted an hour later saying a client emergency had come up and she'd have to cancel. I felt both relieved and defeated at once because the pattern was obvious. She was building walls faster than I could find doors. That night, after she went to sleep again, I searched the name Ellion Strategies online and found almost nothing except a handful of forum posts warning that it was part of a crypto arbitrage scheme that promised impossible returns and disappeared with investors' money. And as I read the stories, my stomach turned because they sounded exactly like the pattern on her laptop: deposit growth, followed by withdrawals, followed by silence. I knew then that the question was no longer whether Mira was hiding money, but whether she had already lost it, and what scared me most was the realization that her silence might not be malicious at all, it might be desperate, which meant that by tomorrow I would have to stop pretending ignorance and ask her directly if our life savings were gone, because pretending calm had started to feel like lying, and I had never wanted to be that kind of husband. When the alarm went off at 6, she stirred beside me, and I watched her face in the half-light, soft and tired and strangely distant, and I thought about all the nights we had spent planning for a future that might no longer exist, and I promised myself that tonight there would be no gentle openings or careful questions, only truth, because the bridge she had built out of our savings looked more and more like a collapse waiting to happen, and I needed to know whether she was standing on it or already falling through. By the time evening rolled around, I had rehearsed the conversation in my head at least 20 times, and every version started calm and ended in smoke, because there is no tidy way to ask someone you love whether they have quietly erased your shared foundation. So I decided not to rehearse anymore and just follow whatever words rose when the moment arrived, because maybe honesty works best when it is raw rather than choreographed. Mira came home a little after 8 holding a takeout bag that smelled like noodles and sesame, and she smiled faintly when she saw me, as though trying to stage normalcy, but her shoulders were stiff, and she moved with the distracted grace of someone balancing too many stories in her head at once. I waited until she set the bag on the counter and slipped off her shoes, and then I said that we needed to talk. The words hung in the kitchen longer than they should have, and her eyes darted toward the clock, even though there was nowhere she had to be. I told her that I had done some research about Ellion Strategies, and her face froze so completely that it almost felt like watching someone blink in slow motion. She didn't ask what I meant or how I knew. She just asked where I had seen that name, and I said that it appeared on the wire transfer list. She pressed her lips together and leaned against the counter like she needed it to stay upright. After a long moment she said it was complicated, which I guess was her way of confirming everything without admitting anything. The story came out in fragments. There had been an online contact she met through a professional network, someone who claimed to represent a boutique investment fund that helped consultants like her park untaxed income offshore for liquidity optimization, which sounded impressive enough to bypass suspicion. He had shown her testimonials and documents that looked official, and at first she had tested it with a small transfer, and when it produced quick returns she felt validated. Then she had moved more and more money, including part of our joint savings, without telling me, because she planned to surprise me with how much she had grown our nest egg. She said this without irony and without looking at me, just staring at the floor as though reading invisible numbers only she could see. The first time the withdrawals failed, she said the representative explained it as a temporary compliance audit, and she believed him because he had always answered quickly until suddenly he didn't. Then came more silence, and her messages began to bounce, and only then did she realize that she had been scammed. The story made sense in that dull, aching way that disasters often make sense after they have already settled in. The money was gone not to some reckless affair or secret addiction, but to an invisible hand promising easy growth. She had fallen for the same kind of digital mirage that traps thousands of people every year, yet hearing that did not make me feel noble or forgiving. It just made me tired. Because while she spoke I realized that what hurt was not the loss itself, but the months of deceit, the locked doors, the feigned meetings, the quiet decisions made without me. She finally looked up and said she was planning to tell me once she had figured out a way to recover it, which explained the secret of laptop sessions and the notes marked withdrawal release pending approval, because she had been clinging to a hope that someone somewhere would click a button and undo everything. I asked how much was gone, and she whispered the number, and it felt like someone had dropped a brick in my stomach. It was every dollar of our savings, every emergency fund, every tax refund we had ever tucked away since our wedding. I sat down at the table because standing required too much belief in balance. She kept talking about how she had contacted cybercrime units and filed reports and how some agency might trace the transfers, but her voice sounded far away, like a recording of someone else reading from a script that promised comfort. I knew better. Once money disappears into those shadowed accounts, it never comes back. We sat in silence for a long time, and the only sound was the rain ticking against the window and the dog's soft snore from the other room. Finally, she asked if I hated her, and I said no, because hate requires energy, and all I felt was hollow. She reached for my hand, and I let her because cruelty would serve no purpose, but the gesture felt like holding the handle of a suitcase I hadn't packed. Later that night, I stepped outside onto the porch to breathe. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes distant traffic sound like the ocean, and I tried to picture the numbers drifting somewhere through networks and servers and fake names, all of it beyond reach. What struck me most was not the financial ruin, but the way trust erodes silently, like water seeping through wood long before it breaks. When I went back inside, she was already asleep on the couch under a blanket we had bought on our honeymoon from a street vendor who promised it would last a lifetime, and for a moment I wondered whether the man who sold it had actually believed that, or whether he too said it just to make the sale. I watched her breathe and felt an unexpected wave of pity, because her betrayal had not been born of malice but of desperation to prove herself, and somehow that made it harder to know what to feel. The next morning I called in sick, even though no fever could explain what ailed me. I spent the day collecting documents, printing statements, and calling every bank department I could think of. The responses were predictable, sympathetic, but empty. Once the funds had cleared overseas, there was nothing they could do. One agent suggested freezing the remaining account balances to prevent further risk, and that phrase "further risk" echoed in my head because it implied that the danger had not finished yet. That evening, Mira sat across from me with a cup of tea she hadn't touched and asked what we were going to do. The word "we" sounded fragile. I told her we would handle the paperwork and secure what little remained, but beyond that I didn't know. I said I needed time to think, which was the truth, though what I really meant was that I needed time to decide whether our marriage still had a pulse beneath the wreckage. She nodded, as if agreeing to a contract she didn't fully understand. When she went upstairs, I stayed behind, sorting the printed pages into a neat stack. The top sheet showed one final transaction scheduled for the following day for an amount that seemed random until I realized it matched exactly what was left in our checking account. I checked the transfer ID and saw it had been pre-authorized last week. That meant the scammer system still had access. It wasn't over yet. For the first time in days, something sharper than fatigue surged through me. I realized that if I didn't act by morning, everything we had left would vanish too. And somewhere inside the labyrinth of numbers there had to be a trace, a mistake, a thread leading back to whoever had stolen our life. I wasn't ready to forgive Mira yet, but I also wasn't ready to lose the last pieces of our future. So that night I made a decision that would change everything. I would not wait for the authorities or the banks or her apologies. I would track it myself. I didn't know how, but I knew that whoever built this bridge out of our money had left footprints on the planks, and by sunrise I would start following them. I woke up before the alarm because my mind was already moving before my eyes opened. It felt like being late for something, even though nothing on the calendar mattered anymore. I sat at the dining table with a cold cup of coffee and stared at the printed bank statements until the numbers began to blur. In those rows of transactions, I started to see a rhythm, small repeating strings that looked like the beginning of a trail if I stared long enough. Mira came downstairs an hour later. Her hair was pulled back, and her face looked pale in the gray morning light. She asked quietly if I had slept. I said yes, even though we both knew I hadn't. She nodded, as if pretending to believe it would help. She offered to make breakfast, but I shook my head. The smell of food made my stomach tighten. We sat there in silence, listening to the refrigerator hum and the rain tapping softly against the window. I told her about the scheduled withdrawal I had found. It was set for that day and matched exactly what was left in our account. Her eyes widened. She whispered that she hadn't set anything new, that maybe the system still had her login credentials saved. She said she'd tried to revoke access but never got a confirmation. Her voice trembled. I could hear both guilt and fear in it, and I understood that she hadn't realized the account was still connected to whoever had taken everything. The thief still had a way in. I asked her for every email, every chat, every trace of communication with the so-called broker. After a moment of hesitation, she nodded. She brought her laptop from upstairs and opened a folder named Bridge Notes. Inside were screenshots and chat logs, all written in the casual style of someone who knows exactly how to sound professional. Phrases like, "Your patience will be rewarded," and "We are preparing your final release." Every message ended with a small symbol, an arrow looping back on itself. I copied everything onto a flash drive so I could look at it alone later. She didn't protest. She just sat still, holding the edge of the table like it was the only solid thing in the room. After she left for a meeting, I started digging into the files. Each message had a digital header that showed where it came from. Most were masked through offshore servers, but one had slipped. A single tag revealed a location. It pointed to a coworking space downtown, not in another country, just 10 miles away. For a long time, I stared at that address. Then I grabbed my jacket and drove out before I could change my mind. The coworking space sat on the 5th floor of a glass building that looked too polished to be trustworthy. The lobby smelled like new carpet. A tired receptionist greeted me with the forced cheer of someone who fields too many strange questions. I asked if any company called Ellion Strategies rented an office there. She hesitated before saying they had, but the contract ended 2 weeks ago. They had moved out overnight and never paid the final cleaning fee. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "They just disappeared," she said. "Didn't even leave a forwarding address." She mentioned that she still had a box of leftover documents the tenants had abandoned. She offered to check it, assuming I was some kind of auditor. A minute later, she handed me a thin folder labeled vendor copies. I thanked her and left quickly before she could ask for ID. In my car, I opened the folder. Inside were a few invoices printed on cheap paper. Each one carried a different fake business name, but one header stopped me cold. It used Mira's old consulting logo, the one she had designed years ago before we got married. Whoever had run this scam had stolen her identity, not just her money. They'd copied her brand to lure other victims who trusted her name. That realization hit harder than the financial loss itself. It meant she hadn't been the only victim. She had been bait. I drove home through the rain, gripping the folder so tightly that the edges bent. The sky looked bruised and heavy, and I couldn't shake the thought that someone might still be using her image to steal from others. By the time I reached our house, I had made a decision. I called a friend from college who worked in cybersecurity. I told him everything. He listened quietly, then asked me to send all the files so he could trace the network paths before they vanished. That night, Mira sat beside me while I composed the email and attached every document. She watched in silence, occasionally pressing a hand against her chest like she was trying to keep her heart steady. I told her about the office, the fake company, and the invoices. She whispered thank you, though it sounded more like an apology. I didn't tell her that I wasn't doing this for her. I was doing it for myself, for the part of me that still believed truth could fix something, even if money couldn't. An hour later, my friend called back. His voice was urgent. The data trail from the invoices pointed to a local bank account registered under a false business name, but the registration had a flaw. It was linked to a real identity. The name was Owen Hartley. I froze. I knew that name. Owen had been one of Mira's clients, a man she described months ago as brilliant with numbers and good at networking. My friend said the evidence wasn't absolute, but it was strong. I thanked him and hung up. When I looked up, Mira was already watching me. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. She whispered his name before I could say it. Then she covered her face with both hands and began to shake. In that moment, the room changed shape. The bridge that had carried our life collapsed in silence. And all I could think was that the man who had stolen everything had once sat at our dinner table, smiling at both of us as if nothing in the world could ever fall apart. For the first few minutes after she said his name, neither of us moved. The air in the room felt heavy, like it had turned into something you could drown in. Mira's hands stayed over her face while I sat there watching the clock on the wall tick louder than it ever had before. The name Owen Hartley kept bouncing around in my head, each repetition sharper than the last. I could picture him clearly. The easy smile, the polished laugh, the way he'd clapped me on the shoulder that night after dinner when we'd all gone out to celebrate one of Mira's projects. He had called me Man of the Hour because I'd just landed a promotion. The memory turned sour in my mouth now. When Mira finally looked up, her eyes were red. She said she hadn't wanted to believe it was him. She admitted that she had trusted Owen more than she trusted herself when it came to the investment. He had told her about the opportunity months ago, swearing it was safe, that it was something only a few insiders knew about. She said she thought he was trying to help her build credibility in her consulting work, that it would show she understood how to grow wealth for clients. The betrayal, she said, wasn't only financial, it was personal. He had pretended to mentor her. I listened quietly. I wanted to believe that she'd been fooled, that her intentions had been naive rather than reckless. But another part of me couldn't stop remembering how many lies it had taken to keep the secret alive. Even if Owen had started it, Mira had chosen to protect him, and that truth didn't let me breathe easily. I called my friend again and asked if the information he found could be shared with law enforcement. He said yes, but he warned me that local authorities rarely moved fast in cyber fraud cases. If Owen was smart, he'd already closed accounts and moved the funds elsewhere. The best chance we had was to report it immediately and hope that the bank could freeze something before it vanished. So that's what we did. We sat at the dining table together, two exhausted people with matching cups of cold coffee, and filled out digital complaint forms. We uploaded every file, every screenshot, every piece of proof we had. The process felt endless, each page demanding more details than the last. When we finally hit submit, the confirmation screen offered nothing but a case number and a line that said, "An investigator will contact you if more information is needed." It felt like whispering into a void. Afterward, I walked outside to the porch and leaned against the railing. The rain had stopped, but the pavement still glistened under the streetlights. Across the street, our neighbor's dog barked once and then went quiet again. I stood there listening to the silence and thinking about how a single person's charm could unravel years of stability. I thought about how easy it is to mistake confidence for honesty. When I went back inside, Mira was sitting on the floor with her laptop open and a mess of papers scattered around her. She was reading through old messages between her and Owen, searching for clues. She told me she found a few odd details, references to meeting in Suite 12B, at that coworking space, a strange phrase he used often, "The bridge has to hold." He had said it in almost every conversation. She thought it was just a metaphor for trust or patience, but now it felt like a signature. We decided to give the folder and all the files to my friend in person. He agreed to meet us at his office the next morning. Mira barely spoke the rest of the night. She sat by the window staring into nothing while I tried to read, though my eyes never stayed on the same page for more than a few seconds. Around midnight, she came to bed and whispered that she was sorry. I told her I knew. That was the truth. I knew she was sorry. I just didn't know if that was enough. Morning brought a gray, quiet light. We drove to my friend's office downtown with the folder sitting between us like a passenger we didn't want to disturb. My friend took the documents, scanned them, and said he'd already begun tracing the secondary accounts Owen had used. He believed there might be at least 4 other victims, all local. The realization hit us both. This wasn't a random scam from across the world. It was a network built right here. That night, Mira received a text from an unknown number. It said, "I can fix this. Don't go to the police." No name, no context. Just that. She showed it to me, her hands shaking. The timestamp was just 5 minutes after we had left my friend's office. Whoever sent it knew. We both sat in silence, the phone glowing between us on the coffee table. Mira whispered that maybe she should reply, maybe he was trying to offer restitution. I told her not to. She said she just wanted to ask if it was really Owen. I told her we didn't need confirmation, we already knew. I could feel her fear mixing with mine until the air felt too thick to breathe. Whoever had sent that message wasn't trying to help. It was a warning. Later that night, I made sure all our accounts were locked, changed every password, and unplugged the home router. Mira sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, staring at the window as if expecting to see headlights stop in front of the house. I didn't tell her what I was thinking then, but the thought was clear in my mind. Owen wasn't gone. He was still close. He knew exactly what we were doing, and I knew that if he thought Mira was going to expose him, he wouldn't just disappear quietly. The text message changed everything. It turned our living room into a waiting room for fear. Mira hardly spoke the next morning. She just sat by the window drinking cold coffee while I checked every lock in the house twice. I told myself that I was being cautious, not paranoid, but every sound from the street made me glance at the front door. We had reported the message to the detective assigned to our case, but he only said he'd note it in the file. That phrase felt like a shrug disguised as procedure. Later that day, my friend called again. He said he'd managed to trace a few new transfers made from Owen's network of shell accounts. The last activity had happened only 3 days ago, and the money had moved into a brokerage account under a company called Northview Capital. The registered address was an office suite in the same downtown building where Ellion Strategies had been. That meant he hadn't gone far at all. He was still operating in plain sight. Mira wanted to go to the police immediately. I wanted to think first. I didn't trust that the police could act quickly enough, not without stronger proof. My friend offered to come with us to meet the investigator in person. He said he could present the data trail himself so they'd understand the urgency. We agreed to meet at the precinct the next morning. That night, Mira and I barely spoke. She stayed on her laptop, scrolling through old messages from Owen, as if reading them again might undo what they meant. I sat across from her, trying to remember every detail from that dinner months ago when Owen had laughed at my jokes and asked questions about our house, our savings, our future plans. Now all those questions seemed like reconnaissance. I kept asking myself how I had missed it, how I could have looked a man in the eye and not seen what he was. Around midnight, Mira finally shut the laptop. She said she wanted to tell me something before it got worse. She admitted that Owen had once asked to meet in person, alone. She said it happened early in their investment conversations, before any money changed hands. They met for coffee. He had talked about risk and opportunity, about timing and trust. She said she didn't feel threatened then, just flattered. He told her that smart people know when to act boldly. That line stuck with her. When she finally transferred the first payment, she was hearing his voice in her head. I didn't say anything. I just sat there watching her twist her wedding ring around her finger until it left a red mark on her skin. She whispered that she had never cheated, that it was never romantic. I believed her, but the truth didn't make it less painful. Betrayal doesn't need romance to leave a scar. The next morning, we met my friend outside the precinct. The detective listened carefully while my friend explained the server trails, the overlapping bank accounts, and the metadata linking everything to Owen. When he finished, the detective leaned back in his chair and said it was enough to open an active investigation. He promised to request a warrant for Owen's business records. That should have been a relief, but as we were leaving, I noticed Mira staring at her phone again. Another text had arrived. "You made a mistake." She turned the screen toward me. There was no number, just unknown sender. My friend took a picture of it for the case file, but the look on Mira's face told me the message had already done its damage. It was fear written in digital ink. We spent the rest of the day at my friend's office, helping him organize the data for the police. He was excited, almost hopeful. He said he'd found logs showing that Owen's company had recently accessed several other clients' accounts, including one belonging to a retired teacher who lived 2 towns over. That connection would make it easier for authorities to prove a pattern. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of control. We drove home just before sunset. The street looked calm and ordinary. Mira went straight upstairs to shower. I stayed downstairs to lock up again. When I walked into the kitchen, I noticed an envelope on the floor near the door. It must have been slid through the mail slot while we were gone. My name was written across it in blue ink. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with one sentence. "Stop looking." No signature. No explanation. Just those 2 words. I stood there reading it over and over while the refrigerator hummed behind me. My hands were shaking. The words felt like a small explosion in my chest. Whoever had written that knew exactly where we lived. I didn't tell Mira right away. She had just stopped shaking from the earlier text, and I didn't want to push her back into panic. I slipped the letter into my jacket pocket and sat at the kitchen table, pretending to check the mail from the day before. When she came down, she asked what I was holding, and I just smiled and said it was nothing important. That night, I hid the letter in the garage under a box of old holiday decorations. I didn't know what to do with it yet. Part of me wanted to hand it straight to the detective. Another part wanted to deal with it myself. I had this strange, steady anger rising in me, something cleaner than fear. It was the first feeling that made sense in a long time. Before we went to bed, Mira asked if I still believed we could get any of the money back. I told her I didn't know. What I did know was that Owen wasn't finished. Not yet. He had gone from a con artist to something else, someone who wanted to keep us afraid. And the more I thought about that, the clearer my next move became. If Owen wanted us to stop looking, then I had to keep going. Because fear wasn't going to be the thing that decided how this ended. I barely slept. The image of that letter burned behind my eyelids. By sunrise, I had decided that waiting for someone else to handle it was no longer an option. The detective had a process. My friend had data. But the man who had stolen everything we built had my address, my name, and now my attention. That changed the balance. Mira was still asleep when I left the house. I drove downtown before the traffic started. The letter folded inside my jacket pocket. The streets were quiet, half-lit by the kind of pale light that makes everything look temporary. I parked near the same building where Ellion Strategies had once rented their office and sat in the car watching people go in and out. Most of them looked like freelancers or small business owners, just regular people with laptops and coffee cups. I waited until the security guard stepped away from the lobby desk, then went inside. I told the receptionist I was there to see Northview Capital. She looked up the name and said their office was on the 3rd floor, Suite 12B, the same suite Owen had used for Ellion Strategies. My pulse quickened. I thanked her and took the elevator up. The door to 12B was closed, but there was light coming from under it. I knocked once. No answer. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again. The door opened halfway, and a man I didn't recognize stepped out. He looked professional. Neat suit, calm face, expensive watch. But something in his expression said he was expecting someone else. When I asked for Owen Hartley, he didn't even try to act confused. He just said, "He's not here," and started to close the door. I put my hand against it before he could. "Then tell him I know," I said. The man hesitated, studying me for a moment. "You should leave," he said quietly. "You're in over your head." I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. "He stole from my family," I said. "You tell him I'm not afraid." He looked at me for a long second, then stepped back and shut the door without another word. I stood there listening to the hum of fluorescent lights in the hallway until it felt like the air itself was pushing me out. When I finally went back down to the street, my hands were still trembling. The building felt too quiet, too normal. Whatever Owen was running, it was still active. I wasn't supposed to see it. I called the detective as soon as I got to the car. I told him what had just happened, gave him the name of the company, and told him they were using the same office. He said he'd send someone to check it out, but I could tell from his tone that it wouldn't happen today. That wasn't good enough. When I got home, Mira was in the kitchen pacing. She said she'd received another text while I was gone. This one said, "You can still make it right. Meet me." It included an address, an abandoned lot on the edge of town. She showed me the screen with tears in her eyes. I told her she wasn't going anywhere near it. I didn't even have to think about that. I called my friend and told him everything. He told me to stay put, to let the police handle it. But I could hear my own voice shaking when I said that I was done waiting. Something in me had already crossed the line from fear to resolve. So I went. The lot was empty, half covered in weeds, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence. A few old trucks sat near the back like forgotten bones. I parked near the entrance and waited. For 10 minutes, nothing happened. Then a black car pulled in from the other side. Owen stepped out. He looked exactly the same as he had the last time I'd seen him. Confident, polished, the same charming smile that had once made us both trust him. "You shouldn't have come," he said, walking closer. "You shouldn't have stolen from her," I replied. He shrugged, almost amused. "She gave it to me." "She trusted you," I said. "That's not the same thing." He tilted his head. "Trust is a transaction. You of all people should understand that." For a moment I thought he might actually feel sorry. But then he smiled again. "The thing about smart people," he said, "is that they always think they're one move ahead. That's what makes them easy." Before I could respond, headlights appeared at the far end of the lot. 2 unmarked police cars rolled in. My friend must have called them after all. Owen turned, startled. I stepped back as the officers shouted for him to stop. He didn't. He ran toward the fence, but there was nowhere to go. They caught him before he made it halfway. I stood there watching as they handcuffed him, his charm gone, his voice swallowed by the noise of the sirens. When one of the officers walked over to me and asked if I was the complainant, I just nodded. By the time I got home, the sky had turned orange with the first hint of evening. Mira was waiting at the door. I told her it was over. She started to cry, not out of relief exactly, but out of exhaustion. We sat on the porch until the sun dipped below the trees. Neither of us said much. The detective called later to confirm that Owen had been taken into custody. They had found several drives and documents in his car linking him to the accounts my friend had traced. It would take months, maybe years, for the case to settle, but it was enough. The investigation would continue. That night, as Mira fell asleep beside me, I lay awake listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator again. The house felt quieter than it had in weeks. We were broke, yes, but we were finally safe. I thought about how easy it had been to mistake stillness for peace and silence for trust. Maybe every life is built on a kind of bridge, fragile and invisible, held up by promises. Ours had collapsed, but we were still standing on what was left. I didn't know what our future would look like, but for the first time since it all began, I wasn't afraid of finding out.